Thank you, brother. Thank you very much, because I came here to look at the differences and similarities between affirmative action and diversity. And I started by talking about something that is so global and so profound that affects humanity as a whole. And to bring one individual as a sacrificial lamb in our discourse, I think is unhealthy and truly unhelpful. The truth is, I'm a leader of a predominantly white institution, and I know the challenges. And until you have stepped into those shoes, I think it is good for us to be humble in the way we chastise someone who we can look at all the social policies that he has represented. Is it the health care that he has struggled so hard that is at variance to what the minority people want? Is it his policy on education that is at variance to what we want? Is it the scaling back of war and trying to get money to come back home to help us that is at variance to what we truly believe in? No. So to come here and point finger to just one individual is again is trying to distract us from the serious issue of affirmative action and what we can do to look at it as a continuum, not the binary, okay, either or, but what we can do to form a more perfect union.
Thank you. You know, I want to say, since it's directed towards me, and I think some of what has been said is fair. I'm not here to throw slings at the president. We're talking about affirmative action. And if Bush were in the White House, you would be talking about Bush today. Let's just be honest. He's the president, and it's not that I'm making attacks on the president, because I voted for him and I respect him. I just want to be clear on that. But I don't think you can separate the issue from the kind of commitment the person in the White House has. But I'm willing to move beyond that. But mine is not an attack. I just think if you're going to talk about the problem, you got to put everything on the table. And I do agree with my man on the end, is that if you were not in the White House, I think affirmative action would be dead, and you have to ask yourself why. I just think that people, in many ways, don't embrace affirmative action. They don't think it's work. They think everything is hunky-dory. You don't need someone out there fighting to get somebody a job. They don't think it's qualified in the first place. I think you have to deal with the basic issues. But if I came off that way, where it appeared that I was attacking our president, let me apologize, because those are not my intentions.
We appreciate that, and we are definitely going to move on. I'm going to ask another question. Just listening to this discussion, and Professor, I guess you can hear us okay here, right? Do you think that we have gotten to a point, and this is for the panel first, because you're going to get your shot at asking some questions as well. Have we gotten to the point that the whole concept, we listened to the distinctions that our French professor has laid out for us between affirmative action and diversity? Have we gotten to the point that just the words affirmative action sends up a message that's so controversial? Should we look at another terminology? Should we look at another model? What do you think?
Is the question for me?
Yes, the question is the terminology of affirmative action.
Okay.
Is it possible that it's so controversial that we should either look at another terminology, or is there another model that we might want to consider?
Okay, from what I've been hearing in the past minutes, it's clear that it's impossible to reconcile everyone on affirmative action, and that the concept itself, as you say, is laden with so much, it's so inflated and it's so controversial today that it becomes difficult to talk serenely about what everyone aims at reaching, which is a colorblind society. Everyone agrees on this topic. The only problem is how do we get there? Or how do you get there? But I would also say that replacing affirmative action either with another term or with proxy, which is something that is being done today, if you look at university college admission procedures, many of the college admission procedures use proxies for race. For example, the neighborhood where the applicant comes from, the essay that the applicant is asked to write, and so on and so forth. And we have developed a system in France too, where racial classifications are simply not allowed. So the problem is very different. You cannot collect data on ethnic identification. There are no statistics. So we do not know how many black people there are, we do not know how many Asian people there are, and so on and so forth. But the French have a proxy system, which I'm not going to say it works better or it doesn't work better, but certainly the rhetoric is much less inflammatory. If I may say so, I think that replacing affirmative action seems to be the case increasingly with word diversity, and I agree with Robin Tucker on this point. Diversity is a big grab bag in which you put everything you want to put inside. I think it has, of course, many advantages in that it refuses to be explained, but it has also many problems and pitfalls which people are not always aware of. Let me just give you an anecdote. I recall an anecdote that took place a few years ago at the French political and economic school called Sciences Po. I don't know if you're familiar with the French system. It's one of the most elite colleges in France. And there was a section on diversity and diversity management at the time, and we invited Renault's CEO, Carlos Ghosn, who was also the CEO of Nissan, and he was, of course, sponsoring the event. So he's telling us that Renault is, of course, in the vanguard concerning the diversity movement, that diversity is essential for business, and so on and so forth. And at one point, this professor from Berkeley, Linda Hamilton Krieger, who is a law school law professor, asked him the very simple question. Okay, if the Japanese have a preference for male salespeople in these family relationships, okay, if you prefer to have a male salesperson instead of a woman, what do you do? Well, he thought for a minute and answered very simply, well, we'll try and find posts for women elsewhere. And I think that's very telling because it simply says it's okay to discriminate. It shows the extent to which students are ready to go in embracing diversity. In other words, if diversity doesn't harm profits, if it's good for business, if it's good for our image, go for it. Okay? But what matters is the bottom line, what matters is the market share, is the customer satisfaction, you see? So I think that if you rely on this economic justification only and drop the moral justification that's behind affirmative action, in other words, you want transfer of competence from the field, from the public sector to private businesses, employers are not accountable to anyone but themselves. So I think this is a bit dangerous, I would say it's a slippery slope. Replacing affirmative action with diversity and letting the business world tell us that diversity is good for business. It may be good for business, although from what I read, from what I've heard, the conversations I've had with many fellow Americans, there is no empirical data, so to speak, that proves without a shadow of doubt that diversity is good for business. It may be good for business. But that is a big yes.
Professor, I'm going to jump in here. If anyone else wants to react to that? Yes. Wow.
Just really briefly. I think that what you call yourself does make a difference. And I do think that saying that we're engaged in affirmative action or we're an affirmative action officer will rile people. And I think that's a good thing. Because I think that if we let diversity, that huge cloud of whatever that means, become the only dialogue that we have, then the really social activist underpinning of what affirmative action was all about, which was a recognition, not simply that it's a good idea to harvest people for business, but that people hurt, that people aren't treated the same, that people don't have money, that people get incarcerated, that they are actually oppressed, gets lost. And instead what we end up doing is talking about what a nice and lovely world we have, mostly, and we congratulate each other on issues of diversity. I'm not saying it's easy, because certainly if we're talking about how people need to change, people often won't want to hear it. But I think that the fight is worth making and not giving up. So I would keep the term.
Anyone else?
I think there is a need for us to look at how we define some of those concepts. I don't see it, as I said, as either or. It's not binary conversation. To the extent that affirmative action represents government action to limit discriminatory practices and redress lingering impact of these practices in selected social situations, I think it will always be necessary for us to be able to implement the policies and agenda of affirmative action. The way I define diversity is somewhat different. And some of this writing has been published in University Business, and some of you might have seen it when I was doing diversity work. I mean, because there we talk about human differences. And this is where I'm going to differ from a comment that I thought I heard earlier that said all differences. I mean, it's not all differences that are important. That you have a black shoe and the other person has a red shoe is immaterial to the diversity discourse that we are talking about. So, but human differences that make variable groups' conceptualization and experience of reality, that bestow unearned privileges and confer undeserved disadvantages within a geopolitical environment, but that can be leveraged to the benefit of humanity. That's a broad definition of what diversity is all about. That it is a group thing. When I say a black man experience in East Cleveland, we know what that means. All right? It's a group thing. But that group has a unique conceptualization of reality and experience of that reality. And there are consequences which confer on unearned privileges to certain people and undeserved disadvantages. And I can unpack this definition forever, okay? But that there's something which the business people now tap into. It can be leveraged for the benefit of the organization and for society. So when we look at that in that realm, we understand that diversity is not at war with affirmative action, because to the extent that there are people who have undeserved privileges and access issues and all this, we need to document all this in order for us to see the consequences of our social policies on certain groups of people. And to the extent that there is a group that is disadvantaged one way or the other, to that extent, we must find a way to redress that policy. That is what affirmative action is trying to point us to.
Thank you very much.